I'm Heather, and this is the Living with Addiction podcast, where I show you how you have more power than you realize when it comes to helping yourself and your child that's struggling with addiction. Hi, everybody. We're back with another episode for season 2. And today I have a guest, and I'm very excited to be starting off the season with this guest because I've thought about talking about this topic before, the topic of grief, because it's so important when dealing with our kids' addiction that we grieve the losses throughout the whole process. You know, grief isn't just about death, it is about all of the losses that we experience in life. And it makes it very hard to move forward and accept our current situation if we aren't grieving the losses as they come up. And so, of course, with my situation, with dealing with the loss of my daughter, I've been very focused on grief, and people have shared some podcasts with me, but I'm like, I'm not ready to do that yet. But then I just happened to hear today's guest on a podcast, and I was like, okay, there's the person I've been looking for. I loved her outlook on grief, and I really resonated with her story. And so, Julie, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the work that you do?
Sure, I'd love to. My name is Julie Cluff. I am a grief coach. I actually train coaches about how to coach in grief, like that specific topic. I work with one-on-one clients. I have an online support community called the True Hope Club. So it's all about education, grief support, and we just don't know. Like you're saying, we as a population, we have very little information about grief, and yet everybody experiences loss. And nothing has been more obvious than the last 2 years of a pandemic. The losses that we experience in a lifetime, they really pile up, and we don't deal with them. And like you said, we have to grieve the losses. It's not just about death, or even a lot of times people will just associate it with death or divorce. And it's so much more than that. And a lot of times we don't even acknowledge our losses. And then we have a loss of energy and we don't know why. And yeah, there's just so much. Yeah. I'm the mom of 6, and my 2 youngest children died in a car accident. And that was the loss that really brought me to the work that I'm doing now. I lost my brother to suicide many years ago, and I went through a divorce from my first husband. And I feel like my life has just been filled with loss experiences and grief experiences, and I've been a student. I've been a student of loss and grief my entire life, and didn't even realize it. But when a few years ago, I got a very strong impression that I was supposed to do something with this. And it's been a very interesting and miraculous journey.
Yeah, and you can, I'm sure, relate with people on so many levels because of all of the losses that you've experienced. And, you know, in the last probably 2 years, I've gone through a divorce and breast cancer and losing my daughter. And so,
Wow.
it's kind of like all of the grieving that I did from the divorce and the breast cancer honestly gave me the skill set that I needed to deal with the loss of my daughter. And so I can't even imagine what I would be experiencing right now, how much more intense it would be if I hadn't taken the time to get that skill set. And so that's why I think this work that you're talking about sharing is so important, because life just keeps happening. Like there are no passes, you know, all of the things that you described you've been through and what I've been through in the last couple of years, like it's just a part of life. So can you share a little bit about how important it is to grieve more than death? I mean, we're talking about these things that come up, you know, when it comes to parents dealing with addiction. I just want to point out, maybe they don't even think of grieving these things, but it's the loss of the relationship or the way they thought the relationship was going to be, or what you think being a mom is going to look like, which, by the way, I've been in group coaching programs and it never looks like we think it's going to look. It doesn't matter whether our kid's dealing with addiction or not. And so, even like the carefree life we had before addiction or other things, other losses come into our life. So, how, the importance of that, and then, how you work with people grieving more than death.
Yeah. Well, you bring up such good points. We're grieving the lost expectations. We grieve the lost hopes and dreams. And there's a gap between the expectation and what we're experiencing. There's a gap between the hopes and the dreams that we had and what we're experiencing. And in that space is a loss. And the loss, the natural reaction to a loss is grief. It's sadness. And because we don't talk about grief in this way, because we don't acknowledge that a loss causes feelings of grief, then we just go about our day thinking there's something wrong with us because we don't feel good. And we're like, why don't I feel good? Like, what's wrong with me that, like, look at all the good that I have in my life. A lot of times I'll hear that from people and they'll even say, well, this happened and this happened, but I still have a good life. Or they discount the pain, they discount the loss. And sometimes, depending on the loss, and we had to be really, really careful about not comparing losses. So for one person, losing their dog could be devastating and life-changing. For another person, it could be just another experience in life, and it's not as impactful. And neither is right or wrong, it's just different. And as humans, we have different relationships with different things. So we're really careful about comparing between people. Like, I'm not going to compare my loss with somebody else's and vice versa, but we can compare the impact of our own losses. So I can put on a scale and I can tell you that by far my most painful, most difficult loss was the car accident when my children died. I was driving the car. I didn't feel sleepy at all. We were traveling across country. I fell asleep at the wheel and my kids died that day. I'm like, devastating. And so often when we experience loss, it's almost universal. We also experience what I call misplaced grief or guilt, because we point the loss back to ourselves and go, oh, what did I do wrong? I should have done this. I should have done that. And we start experiencing all this guilt. Well, in my case, it was very clear who was at fault in the accident. It was a one-car accident. I fell asleep at the wheel. And yet I still had the opportunity to forgive myself, to move on from that place, as difficult as it was. As I don't say this to make it sound like it was easy, because it wasn't easy at all. But I think there's a difference between it's hard and possible versus it's hard and not possible to get over it. And so to move on, to experience healing in that situation. Some of the losses that we experience, all they really need is air. They need acknowledgement. Sometimes we just need to acknowledge the loss, and that's enough. And sometimes it really needs a process to help us to move through, to break it down, to experience it gently and be able to move through. When I was in college, I became really ill and I didn't even know what was going on. I just knew that my grades were just dropping like a rock and I could not focus. And there was all this stuff going on, but I didn't recognize it as physical for a long time. I just thought, there's something wrong with me. And I was dealing with hyperthyroidism or Graves' disease, My thyroid was 3 times the size it was supposed to be. So it was causing an imbalance in my system and making it really difficult. I couldn't focus. I couldn't concentrate. Where I had always been really pretty academically inclined, I was no longer academically inclined. And I ended up leaving college and not finishing when I was a young person. And every time I would go to university and step on that campus, I would feel this sinking feeling. It's because I just wasn't acknowledging the pain of that loss, of that expectation that I had for myself, that I was going to get this degree by the time I was 22 and I was going to do X, Y, and Z and so forth. But the minute I started to acknowledge the loss and acknowledge that was a painful experience for me, 20 years later, when I kind of figured out what was going on, then I was able to forgive myself for what happened. I was able to acknowledge the pain that it created and release the pain. And that's the beauty, is that a lot of times we keep the pain suppressed because we're afraid of the pain. And we're afraid that if we open it up, then we're going to just feel that pain forever and ever and ever. And it's never going to go away. I hear that so many times from my clients. They're like, I'm afraid to feel sad because if I feel sad, it may never end.
You just brought up so many good points. I don't even know where to start. But I mean, the last one I can really resonate with, because for a long time, my preferred emotion was numbness. And so when I started processing my feelings again, I had like a backlog of emotions to process. But definitely by far, like my daughter's addiction got me started on that road of processing emotions. And then dealing with breast cancer, really, like, I think I went back and processed every emotion I'd ever had during that time. And it did seem like at times it would never stop. But then that gave me the confidence in my ability to process emotions now, where I could just sit with my grief after my daughter died and really feel the intensity of it the first like month and a half. And now I don't want to say, like you said, that it's not that it's easy in any way, but like I can just let it come up. A little while ago, I picked up my phone to look for something. There was a picture of my daughter on there that I loved. And I just started grieving, but it passed through me within like 2 or 3 minutes. And so I think that like once we build that skill of grieving, that it does process faster than people think. Is that what your experience is with your clients?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll work with somebody and it's been 6 or 7 years since a traumatic loss. And then the minute they start working on it, they start gaining those skills, there's a loosening. There's a loosening of the pain, where the pain has felt really stuck and stagnant for a long time, and there's been an avoidance of it. Then now they have like, oh, there's a way, there's something I can do with this. And to be clear, so many times we hear that there's nothing you can do, just wait it out. And I think that is so sad that we're telling people that, because in the waiting, they're not gaining the skills that would help them along the way and make it not easy, but easier, like you said. And then they feel completely disempowered, because basically they're being told there's nothing you can do. You just have to wait it out. And waiting it out a lot of times doesn't work and doesn't help. And then we think, oh, well, this is my lot in life. I just have to be in this place. I just have to feel this way the rest of my life. And that's not been my experience.
I love that message. I think it's so important, because I felt that way at first when my daughter first died. I was like, I joined a couple of grief support groups, and the outlook was really bleak. I mean, years and years down the road, they're still living in that such devastation. And for me, I know that like I can experience more than one feeling at a time. I can be experiencing the grieving and the sadness and missing her, but also love and joy about the moment that I'm in or the people that I'm with right now. And so I was so happy when I heard your message that you had come to a place where you had created a better life, that you had learned and grown from the situation, because I wanted to believe that for myself. I was like, I just can't live thinking that my life is over and I'm never going to be able to experience real joy again. And I want to connect to my daughter through love in her death, the same way I did in her life, instead of through guilt and trauma and just grief. And so you shared, how I heard you on this podcast and a couple of your other podcasts that I listened to, sharing how you had built a better life since this, that used this situation to be intentional. And it was easy for me to see that on the other side of addiction, or when I had worked through it for a long time, or even with my breast cancer, like how much it had helped me and changed my life in a positive way. And initially, I had a ton of resistance to thinking about building any thoughts of a better life without my daughter.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of times the parents that listen to this podcast might hear me say that my life was better after my daughter's addiction, that it helped me grow and change. And I can see how they could have resistance to that, the way I have resistance to the idea that my life could be any better now. So can you share some about how like what changes you made in your life, or how this experience helped you change and grow?
Yeah, I think what's really important is to separate what happened from the change. What happened, the devastation that we experienced, the trauma, the guilt, the grief, the shame, even all of that we experience is the experience of the loss. And I'm trying to find the best way to explain this. It's not that my life is better because my kids died. It's my life is better because I had to find a better way. So it's not because of the experience. It is indirectly, but it's not because of the experience, but we can use that experience, which is a catalyst to change, because the only way to heal from such devastation is to change. That's the only way. That's the only choice. We either stay there in this place of trauma, or we choose a different way and we make choices. And that's where our empowerment is. That's where the power is, the personal power to make choices, to be intentional, to decide that I do want to be happy someday. And it's okay if I'm not happy in this moment. Totally okay. And I often tell people, don't judge your future by how you feel right now. And a lot of times I think that's what happens is we're right in the middle of this yuckiness of grief and this heaviness of a loss. And the grief is part of the healing process. So if we start to look at it as part of the healing process, that it's transforming us in these small incremental ways as we choose in to be changed, then we can use our grief to transform and create a life that we love again, despite the loss. I think that's where the confusion comes in and why we get this very distinct message, especially, since I've been in this space the last few years, I see how really, really strong the message is that you have to carry grief the rest of your life. And I don't subscribe to that. But I get it, because we think that the only way to let go of the pain is to have changed the loss. Well, we can't change the loss. So therefore, the conclusion is we have to hold on to the pain. The loss is still there. What we experience still happened, but we can let go of the pain. And like you mentioned before, really build that love and that gratitude for the relationship that we did have, or for the thing that we did have, because everything is always changing. Good never stays. The bad never stays. It's like everything is shifting and changing.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you said we need to separate what happened from the growth.
Mm-hmm.
And even separating what happened from the gratitude. I mean, I try to really practice gratitude or seeing God or how things are happening for me in a situation in spite of how tragic it is. And I think that I didn't have the words for that, to separate, what happened from the growth or the gratitude, but I think it's just kind of happened naturally in this situation, just seeing the love that's been there for me and the people that are put in my path, like that I just happened to catch you as a guest on this podcast, like I was like, I need a mom who's been through this, who is living a message of hope. And hope is the word I've used several times. I've even posted that I felt like that I didn't have hope, and that's what bothered me. And then here you come along with the True Hope Club is the name of your group coaching program. And it's just, that to me is, I have so much gratitude that I got to hear that and see another message of hope that we can experience. You said my life is better because I had to find a better way, not because of the event. And I love the way you put that, because that's exactly what happened with my daughter's addiction and, what happened with breast cancer. Like I had to find a better way to deal with it, to live my life, to open up to experiencing the full spectrum of human emotion instead of numbness. And so I think that, and I love also you mentioned like, don't judge your future by how you feel now. Because I think that sometimes it feels like it's never going to stop. You're dealing with grief or addiction.
It does feel that way. In fact, I had the dreaded, virus a month or so ago. And it had been a long time since I'd been sick. And anytime, you end up with a flu or something, it's like right in the middle of that, you're like, I am never going to feel well again. Like I literally had those thoughts, like, I am never going to have the energy to get up and work again. And that's a very, very minor example of that. But it's the same concept. It's the same idea. It's like in the middle of it, it feels like there is no shore in sight. Like there's no way of getting to where we want to go. And I think in grief too, it's like we don't have a path. It's like, of course I can't get there. Like that's what our brain says. Of course you can't get there. You don't know how. And that's why I found it so important that we create a path. Because if we don't have it, our brain wants to know how. And we can't answer all the hows before we get started on a journey. But it's like using a GPS. We don't know exactly what stores we're going to be driving past or what stoplights are going to stop us along the way or whatever, but we have a path. Like we've got the little highlighted road that says go this way. And I think that's super helpful. Also, can I just mention why I call it the True Hope Club?
Yeah, please.
So I was reading, I like to use the 1828 dictionary, Webster dictionary, which is kind of interesting. I like to look at the way they defined things, a couple hundred years ago. I think it's interesting. And I was reading about hope in this dictionary. I looked it up for some reason, and it said something along the lines of this certainty of expectation.
Mm.
So when we think wish, it's kind of like, we'll say hope. I hope this happens, or I wish this would happen. And we tend to, in our vocabulary, tend to interchange those words, wish and hope. And I like to share with people that hope is so much more than wishing. Hope is like this expectation that this thing is going to happen. And hope is like, I think it's part of our DNA. I really do. I feel like it's part of our DNA. And one of the reasons why grief is so uncomfortable and being stuck in grief when it goes on and on, like it does for people, like you mentioned, these groups, when it goes on and on, it's so uncomfortable because it's not the way we're made. We're not made to be stuck in sadness forever. We're made for growth. We're made for healing. All you have to do is scratch your finger and know that you're made for healing. And I think that physical example translates into the emotional as well.
Yeah, that's a really great example. Like if we scratch our finger, we're not thinking, oh my gosh, it's going to stay this way forever. It's never going to heal. But when we
Mm-hmm.
feel pain or discomfort, we think it's going to last forever. I mean, and I was stuck in that a couple of weeks ago thinking, I'm never going to have the desire to create anything in my life again. I was
Yeah.
like, how can that I feel that way? And like everything else, I had to give myself time to rest, but I also had to know when it was time to start helping myself create that. And I think maybe
Mhm.
that's part of what you're talking about when you talk about having that clear path. How do
Yeah.
you help your clients with that?
Well, I developed the hope model of healing. Everything is around hope, as you can see. The hope model of healing, which includes 5 foundations of growth. And I think when truth strengthens us, and falsehoods, lies weaken us. They just do. Like, just, I don't know if you're familiar with kinesiology, or but they've actually associated physical weakness with lies.
Mhm.
Like if your name is Heather, but if you said my name is Joe, it would actually, they could test, you would test weaker. So infusing truth into our grief experience so that we understand what coping is, what choices we're making in coping, what choices we can make, so that we understand grief. So we know that it is part of the process of healing, so that we know that if we open up to our sadness, it won't last forever. In fact, I often use a visual with my clients. It changes, but it's the basic idea is if you have a bathtub full of dirty water and you let the plug up, it drains, right? But it doesn't drain forever and ever and ever and ever. There's an end to the amount of dirty water held in the tub. And it's kind of the same with our grief and our sadness when we allow, like you've been talking about, like processing your emotions by allowing them, by sitting with. We don't do enough of that. We don't have enough of an understanding about emotions, period. And with cell phones and tablets and electronics and all these things that we have available to us, we never have to sit with our emotions if we don't want to. And it creates this life of just getting by.
Yeah, these, like my mentor calls them false pleasures, like all of these things that like social media or whatever we use it are just distractions, but not helping us change and grow and feel. And I think that it was just, it was kind of like this, like, that you need to do it, but there's just that huge fear of doing it. And so, I'm always talking about how, like you said, I like processing my emotions and learning to do that and being willing to feel them and knowing that they're just a feeling, a vibration in our body. They are not going to kill us, even though some of them feel very terrifying. Like it's a
Mhm.
real feeling that we're experiencing, but we have to keep reminding ourselves that it's just a feeling. And like you said, the tub of dirty water won't drain forever. And so, but it's not sexy, right? It's
Yeah.
not very fun sounding.
Mhm.
But on the other side of it is just the key to living a fulfilling life.
Well, and I would also just offer that it can be gentle.
Yeah.
Grief can be gentle. We can actually set an intention to grieve gently. There's a need to understand grief and understand the properties, the qualities of grief, to understand that rest is part of the grieving process. That, when we're physically injured, we require a lot of rest because that's when our body heals. And it's the same with our emotions. that there's healing in the rest. But a lot of times what people do is they feel so guilty about resting that they undo any good that happened during the resting because they're just heaping. And that's a lot of what we work on is like, how can we eliminate the unnecessary heavy emotions that we pile on top of grief? How can we get in that place where we're just gently allowing the grief? What are some strategies for when grief shows up at times when it's not convenient, when we're not in a crowd that we feel comfortable falling apart? What do we do with that? Like all these questions, that we have that go unanswered, but are answerable. And that's what we want to do is we want to create some knowledge and skill around loss and grief, because my loss experiences are not my last loss experiences. I will have other losses in my life. And the one thing that I love is when we learn these foundations, they truly become foundations that are built under us so that when things come up, we know what to do. Do we do it perfectly? No. Are we meant to do it perfectly? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But the most important thing in grief to know is that it is okay to grieve. Like people don't even recognize that it's okay. And they think that, yeah, it's okay to grieve and it's okay to want something more.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you point out that it's a foundational skill, because sometimes we feel like that we shouldn't have to take the time to grieve or to spend the time on it or take the time to learn how to deal with your child's addiction, that they should just figure it out and heal on their own, when really it's a chance for us to build a foundational skill that we will need throughout the rest of our life. Like you said, the losses don't stop.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it leads to acceptance of our situation when we take the time to grieve and just accept where we are. And then we can move into that growth. One thing that I heard you talk about that I loved, which was like how you had experienced that being in that state of constant review, like where you were constantly reviewing the car accident, but that you always came to the same conclusion. And it was, I've experienced the same thing. I know that parents do it over and over again with trying to get to like, where did the addiction start? Where did I go wrong? And we spend so much time and energy on the problem that we don't have any energy left for the solution or to even think that there could possibly be a solution. So do you want to talk about like how you manage that review process for yourself or with your clients?
Well, I think the review process is just part of the process. Like we're not going to eliminate it completely. We just won't. Our brain is looking for answers. And so we're going to go through this thing, but there's a few things like in light of what you were saying about, having a child who's struggling, drug addiction or any other type of addiction or struggle that a child has. We do go through that review process of like, oh, what did I do? But life is so much more complex than that. And really, it kind of goes back to like when we were in elementary school and we were told, you're not the center of the universe. We think that everything began and ended with us. Like, oh, if I had just said this, or I remember like really going through that after my brother died by suicide. Like, what could I have done differently? Why didn't I call this day? Why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do that? Like any of the losses that I experienced, I go through that process and I think it's normal and natural. But at the end of the day, we have to say to ourselves, there's a bigger picture. I think you mentioned this earlier, this idea that life happens for us. When my kids died, they were 8 and 10. David was 8, Carrie was 10. And my 2 oldest daughters were at college. And then my 2 sons were at home. They were 15 and 12. So everybody had been home. And then all of a sudden, there were 4 of us at the house, my husband and I and the 2 teenage boys. teenage years are rough anyway. And then I'm in this situation where I'm not paying attention because I'm in this horrific grief, PTSD, everything you can imagine, like just heaped on me, emotionally unavailable, emotionally checked out, just in a really, really hard, terrible space. And then I would feel so guilty that I wasn't there for my boys the way I wanted to be there. And I remember like this point of truth that just was highlighted for me. And it was, Julie, this is their experience too. Like their experience in high school is to have a mom who's checked out. And it's okay. It's part of their experience. It's part of their, for whatever reason, that's the life experience that they needed for life to happen for them in this strange way. And we don't understand it all. And I don't pretend to understand it all. But I do have a very, very much a belief in God and belief that everything is happening for our greater good, as painful and as difficult as it is. But I will say that even when I was at a place where, like at the 3-year mark, I had a really amazing experience that kind of like turned the lights on for me. But it was 2 years after that, 5 years down the road, that all of a sudden I was reading a book on grief and reviewing my own experience. And all of a sudden because I had thought, I'm never going to be grateful for this experience. I'm never, ever. People always say, oh, I'm so grateful for this or that. Like, I'm never going to feel that. And all of a sudden, 5 years later, I'm reading this book, and all of a sudden, I'm just flooded with so much gratitude. Not that this horrible thing happened, but for the person that I was becoming because of it. Like, I was so grateful for that expansion of my soul that I couldn't have imagined happening otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a beautiful gift that you gave to yourself by being willing to do all of the work that it took to be that person, which is a decision that we all have to make in our lives, that we're going to be willing to do that work, to give ourselves that gift. And I think that something that you said, a few things that you said that are very probably relatable to parents who they have one child or maybe more that's struggling with addiction and they have other kids. I only had one child, so that wasn't my experience. So I don't get to talk about it a lot, but how guilty parents feel because of the experience their other kids have, because they're so focused on trying to rescue and help the child that's struggling with addiction, that their other kids end up feeling, almost abandoned or left out. And then they feel guilty about that too. And like, I love, that you pointed out that that is their experience and they can grow from that experience. Mm-hmm. And I had to have that realization with my daughter about her addiction. Like, this was her journey. This was her path. I had to allow her to have her own experience. Mm-hmm. And I think that even in the end, that when the review process comes up for me about how could I have stopped her from using the day that she died, maybe I should have been there, but it was her choice to make at that time. I was supporting her in every way that I could. As an adult, I had made the choice with her addiction to allow her to be on her own path, but love and support her. But I couldn't stand over her and make sure that she didn't use. Mm-hmm. And that idea of each of us having our own journey and our own path is very freeing to me as well. It was something that really helped me when I decided, I really believe that feels like a universal truth to me.
Absolutely. I believe it truly is a universal truth. We are all on our own journey. Life isn't just happening for our good. It's happening for the good of everybody around us and whatever that experience is. And when things are good, it's super easy to believe that. And when things are hard, it's super hard to believe that.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. Well, I could keep talking forever.
It would be fun.
Because we came up, there was just so many great things in this conversation. I think it's going to be so helpful to everybody that listens. So I just want to thank you again for your time being here today. Listeners, I'm sure they're going to want to find out more about you. So can you tell them where they find you, your podcast, all the good stuff?
Sure. Yeah. So buildalifeafterloss.com. So at buildalifeafterloss.com, it's a bit of a mouthful. You can find the podcast. Of course, it's on all the podcast apps. You can find the True Hope Club and get in there and learn those foundational pieces. Or you can schedule a time to meet with me. I offer a 30-minute consult if somebody is like, oh, what would it be like to work with Julie? Could she help me with some of these things? Let's jump on a call and find out. I also have a free webinar a recording that's available at buildalifeafterloss.com/gift, GIFT. So,
okay. We'll put all that in the show notes so that you don't have to memorize that. So go there and look for that if you want to look up any information about Julie. And then thank you again so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Good to talk to you, Heather.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to learn more about my work, go to heatherrosscoaching.com. If you want to help other parents who are struggling with a child's addiction, you can do it two different ways. First, you can share the podcast with them directly, or you can share it on your social media. Second, you can leave a review. Talk to you next week.